Welcome back, everyone, to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization show, the home of Googlization Nation, where we talk with HR and business thought leaders about the crazy, never normal shift going on all around us. Our goal is to bring you ways to reimagine tomorrow and explore the ever-changing convergence of people, business, and technology. Here is your host, Ira Wolfe.
I've seen polling experts mention that for decades, their polling has been very accurate, except when Donald Trump is in the race. And then they're really struggling to get accurate polling data. And I think we should ask ourselves why.
Polls are close and meaningless. And what I'm saying is they are meaningless in the sense of a tool to predict the outcome. I think in the US, sometimes you use ridiculously small sample sizes. I think you make way too much analysis about little changes or subcategories that are really not meaningful.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization show, and another edition of our new monthly series at the corner of Main Street and Wall Street, where we meet each month at the intersection of the economy, politics, and technology. We realize you have a lot of listening and watching options and are grateful you've taken the time to join us. We are just days away from the crucial U.S. election, that one of our guests called the World Cup of elections. The outcome will decide the future of our country. And as our political guests have noted, this is one of the most interesting and margin-thin close races in history. But it's not just about the political race. We'll explore the factors that will help shape this election, from the power of money and media to the importance of the message and avoiding major mistakes. We'll discuss the impact of polarization, voter turnout, and the elusive low propensity and undecided voter. We'll even get insights from our guests on how young people can overcome the challenges of entering the political world. To guide us through this intricate terrain, we've invited two incredible guests with firsthand experience in the political arena. Dr. Wendy Davis, a political scientist who ran a captivating campaign for the Utah House of Representatives. Her book, The Fight You Don't See, offers a rare glimpse into the world of local politics and the dedication it demands. Dr. Perron is an international political consultant and author of Beat the Incumbent. Dr. Perron brings a global perspective to this conversation, drawing parallels between U.S. elections and campaigns around the world. So buckle up, folks. It's time to welcome Wendy, Lewis, and my co-host for the day, John Aidan Byrne. Unfortunately, our other co-host, which you're familiar with on Main Street and Wall Street, is Matt Van Alstyne. And Matt is somewhere in the wilderness. Although he attempted to get on by Starlink or some other means, it just wasn't there. So he's enjoying a few days away from the world that we're in, enjoying some camping. So he'll be back next month for our future episode. But meanwhile, we've got a great conversation today, and can't wait to get into it, talking about the upcoming election, with some people who have had experience in the election and running some campaigns, involved in some campaigns. John, I think you've got a great leadoff question as well. So.
Yeah, we're only within days of the U.S. elections for president, vice president, local elections, Senate and House. And we have two really apt guests with us, Dr. Wendy Davis, who ran her own campaign. We can get into that in a little bit. That was a fascinating book. I just finished it yesterday, Wendy, on your campaign in Utah. And then we have got Dr. Perron, who wrote another apt book, Beat the Incumbent. But I want to start with Wendy, because you've been in the trenches. You know how the political system works. You're here in the United States. Politics is in your blood. How do you look at the current elections, where the trends are going? How might you handicap this? And let me just preface that by asking you another pertinent question. America is so polarized right now, so divided. It almost feels it'll be a 50-50 election, give or take a few percentage points here or there. You know, that's maybe unusual historically. We need a decisive winner, but I don't think we're going to get that. So how do you see that for the presidential elections, local elections, and tell us more about yourself as well?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to the show. It's a pleasure to be here today to speak with all of you about something that is absolutely of interest to me. What do I think of the elections coming up? That is a question. I think it's one of the most interesting elections that I've experienced in my lifetime. I've been an active voter since the time I was eligible to vote. I've been a student of political science my entire life. And this one's going to be close. I think it will be razor thin. And all of the experts are saying that. We know that there are a number of swing states that will likely decide this election. And it really comes down to what are the voters valuing and how are they voting with respect to those values, right? So are they kitchen table issues like inflation and the cost of groceries and the cost of gas and the cost of my electric bill? Are they social issues, reproductive rights, border crises, things like that? And you talked a little bit about the divide, John, and I think that's where it is ideologically, voters value different things. So some that value one thing cannot understand how the other side can't see their point of view. And conversely, if you value, economics and other things, you can't understand why people are worried about the morality of a particular candidate. So there is a massive divide there. I was caught unaware in 2016. I thought that would go a different way. I absolutely took off my political science hat and put on a hat that was very different and got caught up in an echo chamber. Won't make that mistake again. One of the things that I found very interesting, and I'd be interested to hear what all of you think, is that I've seen polling experts mention that for decades, their polling has been very accurate, except when Donald Trump is in the race. And then they're really struggling to get accurate polling data. And I think we should ask ourselves why. Not exactly sure. Is there not enough deep canvassing going on? Is the sample size not correct? Or have the methodologies changed? Are people just not being forthright with their opinions? So this one won't be decided on election night. I will tell you that. There will be a cadre of attorneys for both campaigns at the national level that will be at the ready to defend voting rights and processes that happen. So that was a lot to unpack.
No, and I think that's, we'll have Dr. Lewis Perron pick that up. But for our listeners, you ran for the Utah House of Representatives in 2020 on the Democratic ticket. It was a nail-biting campaign since you came within a whisker of winning. You didn't unseat the incumbent, but you lost by 78 votes. But you picked up more than 9,000 votes, half of your district. You nearly flipped it. Louis, what's your thoughts on what Wendy just brought up, knowing that she herself was an incumbent and the Trump factor in polling and the confusion and all the noise?
Yeah, a couple of things. Thank you for having me. Looking at things from a distance sometimes helps you see the forest and not get lost in the trees. And I think that every US presidential election since 2000, with one exception, 2008, was close, awfully close. Many cycles in a row, polls have been totally off and pundits have been totally wrong. So I would like to caution about all the stories that we're telling about what is happening might be correct, might be wrong. It's not only Donald Trump. I remember in the last midterm election, the narrative among pundits was that Democrats are totally lost. that they have no chance of holding on to the House. Well, guess what? I saw simulations that I think a few 10,000 votes in the right districts could have changed who controls the House. Now, as somebody who is using polls a lot in my daily work as a consultant, I wrote a piece for Newsweek months ago where the title was "The Polls Are Close and Meaningless." And what I'm saying is they are meaningless in the sense of a tool to predict the outcome. I think in the US, sometimes you use ridiculously small sample sizes. I think you make way too much analysis about little changes or subcategories that are really not meaningful. And mostly you guys weigh data. And I'd like to challenge here and say, if you weigh your raw data, you're acknowledging that you can't do random sampling, which is, of course, the heart and essence of public opinion polling. So do not take them with a grain of salt, but with lots of salt.
Yeah, I'd like to inject this and see if you both of you agree with this or not. But our last episode, we had Dr. Chris Borick, who's a political scientist as well as you guys, but he's also leads the Institute of Public Opinion at Muhlenberg College. So he was talking about the polls that he was doing. And, he pretty much admitted what you just did about some of the inaccuracies, some of the challenges. Trump has been a challenge. So, agreed with you on that point, Louis. However, he said it will, the one factor that that pollsters can't control is who actually shows up to vote. What the polls are saying is, if I have a choice and if I vote, this is who it might be. But they have to show up, and so there's demographics. Yeah.
Even the exit polls in 2016 were wrong. It used to be the most accurate polls because you knew who was voting. They were corrected and adjusted in hindsight. They were actually wrong. They were predicting that Hillary Clinton would win in several of the swing states, way off. I would actually be curious to see qualitative data. I would like to see focus groups with white men, with black men, because I think that effective campaigning is as much about listening to voters as it is about doing the talking.
Should be added, the pollsters also got it wrong in 2020 by quite a large margin.
Yeah, that's so interesting, Louis, because there's a lot of talk, especially yesterday, where both Trump and Harris were focused on, was going after the low propensity voter, which is young black men. And, again, if they show up at a higher rate, how does that impact that? So they have identified that they could be the swing voter, but they're still not sure how they're going to vote. So,
yeah, I think that's right. Mentioning voter turnout, Ira, I think is really intriguing. The millennial generation in the United States absolutely could be the largest voting bloc. They tend not to be. We know as political scientists that younger voters don't turn out in as high number as those of us who are older. There are some definite reasons for that. Some strategies that I've seen recently in the last couple of months is to try and register as many young voters as possible. The assumption might be made that they'll vote in one direction or the other, but we will still see the lowest voter turnout among those who are 18 to 25. The millennials still will not turn out in the kind of impact voting that they absolutely could have. My state has mail-in voting. So we will have very high turnout rates. We will have probably upwards of 80 to 90%, which is just shocking, right? But there's so many factors. You're absolutely right. Who is actually going to turn out? And I think that is a very big unknown. We used to think that the higher the voter turnout, that it benefited Democrats. I don't know that that's necessarily the case all the time, especially in a state like Utah, which is a very red state. More voters turning out does not necessarily benefit that particular party. So you're right. Voter turnout will be very curious to see how that goes. And the states are not all consistent. my state has mail-in voting, Oregon. Other states like Pennsylvania, while you might have early voting, they can't even tabulate ballots until the day of the election. Or, there's early voting in my home state of Illinois that's happening. There's just these hybrid methodologies for voting. So I just don't think we'll know on election night. I think we're going to need to sit tight for perhaps a couple of weeks.
Louis, you've talked about the 4 M's of campaigning, and by the way, congratulations on the TED Talk. I don't know how many TED Talks I've started to listen to, and it's incredible. And yours was about 10 minutes or so. But at the end, it's like you're sucked in, and it's like I just want more. Because you just started to get the tip of the iceberg, which is what a TED Talk is supposed to do. But you talked about the 4 M's, and as you were going through each of them, it was like that was in 2019. I think you recorded that. It's like you could have done it yesterday. You could have done it this morning, for that. But I wanted to, if you could tell our listeners what the 4 M's are, but also when you got to the second one, which was media, you talked about in 2016, Trump really utilized the media well, whether you agree, however the outcome was. But you also talked about his authenticity. And I guess this rolls into some of the other parts too, about maybe the make no mistake. Is he over relying on his authenticity? With that, he obviously has created a loyalty. Some even view it as a cult to that extent, but there's a sense of loyalty. Is it being overplayed? So there's a lot there. If you can walk us through those 4 M's, and then what's changed? Has anything changed over that couple-year period that you talked about?
Sure, I'd love to. So what I'm saying in the TEDx talk is that it takes the 4 M's to win an election: message, media, money, and make no mistake, or make no major mistake. Now, you can compensate. If you have more money, you need less good of a message. You have more tools available within the media. But it helps if you have all 4 of them, or at least a certain amount of all 4, and you can manage. Now, it's a model that I think wherever there are competitive elections, you can apply. And if you have the 4 M's, you're in pretty good shape. Now, for Donald Trump, I agree that the authenticity really helps him a lot. And I think with Donald Trump, it's like, and it's nothing new, actually. It's often in politics, your biggest strength is your biggest weakness, right? And with him, that's nothing new, but it's just more extreme in his case, because I think he's now the most polarizing politician on God's earth. You love him or you hate him. I think authenticity plays a big role in this, both his appeal, because people, every day he says outrageous things, and people wonder, how does he get away with it? And I think the answer here is because people like, or at least many used to like, how he says it, that he is authentic, that he says what's going through his mind and says it the way it goes through his mind is what has great appeal for his base. It also hurts him a lot with all the others that are not his base. And I think this is where I would like to go back to the undecideds. Now there's a lot of talk about that they're undecideds. Honestly, I'm not sure. How can you be undecided? If you know about the conviction, you know January 6th, you know the mismanagement on COVID, you hear him ramble every day, and you're undecided? Don't you fool me. You're not undecided. You're a hidden Trump voter.
I would just pick up real quickly on that, Louis, on Trump. You said he's polarizing. I would argue potentially the nation itself is polarized. We have so much, we have so much systemic problems. We could go down a rabbit hole. But you mentioned money, which was interesting, and I want to come back to Wendy on this. Wendy, I'm sure, spent a considerable sum on your fascinating campaign in Utah coming within a whisker, 78 votes, I believe. And the book is great the way you described that. It could be turned into a movie. But then a candidate who went back in and challenged the gentleman you didn't unseat, he filed the registration fee, $100, and just literally spent $100 this go round, and picked up over 40% of the vote. So
Right.
money is certainly one thing, but I often wonder if there's clever ways around that.
There are. Listen, if money could win elections, Bloomberg would be president, right? That's
Yeah, right,
that's my mom.
exactly.
You do need money to run a campaign, unquestionably, and that's probably my least favorite part. As an independent person who likes to do it herself, I really disliked calling people and asking for money. But it's a necessary part of it. In Utah, when I ran 4 years ago, I was able to run a campaign on less than $100,000. And the reason that I came so close is the district was flippable. And you talk about this divide. And I live in the reddest state in the country. But there's that whole rural urban split. I live in Salt Lake County, which trends very Democrat. And as you go from downtown Salt Lake to further south, as you're heading toward the south end of our county, it starts to go from blue and it turns purple and it turns red. And my house district, I'd watched that for 3 years, and I could see that it was turning purple. So I took a gamble, and with a modest amount of money, with what Lewis said, a solid message, and quite frankly, a lot of grit, meaning just out knocking doors every day, was able to go quite far. And unquestionably really worried the Republican Party when it came really within striking distance. And on election night, I was winning by almost 1,000 votes. In fact, the incumbent had thought that he had lost, and I was astonished that I looked like I was doing really, really well. And then as ballots come in through the mail, that lead dissipated. So as a present, when redistricting happened in 2021, it wasn't shocking to me that they'd removed me from that district, that competitive district. I live 1.3 blocks. I can see where the boundary is. And as you read, John, I tried to fight this legally, right? There were lots of legal avenues to fight this. But the truth is, I don't have the resources to hire a cadre of lawyers to fight this. This is actually in court right now in Utah, and I won't go into the detailed complications, but the maps that our legislature has drawn are all in question. But to go back to what you were saying, in 2022, I begged anyone, please just run against him. If for no other reason, you putting your name on the ballot will give us data and tell us what the base is. If you do nothing else, we will know how many people are going to vote for a Democrat no matter what. So that's what happened. A nice citizen put his name on the ballot, didn't even have a website, and got almost 43% of the vote by doing nothing, right? So talking about a deep divide, at that point in time, it flies in the face of a little bit of the theory that the money matters and this and that matter. I didn't lose my election because I didn't have enough money. I lost my election by 78 votes, right? I didn't lose my election because of anything nefarious, and had 2 more people in every precinct, every neighborhood voted for me, then I would have won. And nobody loses more sleep over that than me. And that's the fight you don't see, right? That's why I named the book that. The fight you don't see is those little incremental things that matter in the background and can make all of the difference.
Yeah, I'm sure Al Gore has the same thoughts at night still.
Professor Davis, you did lose. You were not cheated.
I did. I was not. Oh goodness, no, I was not cheated.
I'm glad to hear that.
No, and
that's
if
something. That's something.
No. I have complete trust in the veracity of our elections, and never ever question that. It was my loss, and like I said, if anybody has a right to question anything, it's me, and I do not question that. I absolutely own that loss, which, also, John, thank you for saying kind words about the book. It means a lot to me, especially coming from from someone like yourself, who is an author and a journalist. And, you know, there's not a lot of firsthand political narratives written by people. We have really famous people. The Obamas have written books. Mitt Romney's written a couple of books. Hillary Clinton has written books. Katie Porter wrote a book. It's typically a foray when someone's going to make it on a big political stage. But what about like a local candidate who lost? Who wants to hear about that? Right? And that noise got in my head, like, nobody wants to hear about your loss. And I thought, you know what, but there's a story to tell here. My journey didn't end on election night with a 78-point loss. That journey kept going. And it's a story worthy to tell. And there are tens of thousands of candidates in the United States running this election cycle for school board, for water district, for county council, for mayors, for all the state legislative positions. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people just like me. And that's why it was important to tell that story. I mean, we're all worried about the big things, and we should be. But what happens at our local level, what my school district does affects my property taxes more than what the legislature does and more than what happens in Washington. So these local races are really, really critical. And I'd be curious, you know, Lewis, if you agree, on election night, I'll be watching the national races. I'll be looking at where are we performing well in the United States Senate, which states are coming in for the House. That's going to be a big indicator of how the presidential election will go, even though we probably won't know on election night. So,
well, Lewis can address that, but I wanted to quickly mention something and not take up too much time on it, because it did get my attention. You mentioned a Republican, Ronald Reagan, fondly in your book. You said you loved him when you were young. My question, do you still hold that same regard for Ronald Reagan today? And if so, why? Because you're a Democrat, a diehard Democrat, I suppose. You also voted for a Republican, George H.W. Bush, over Democrat Bill Clinton after praying on it. You say in the book.
that needs some context. That needs some context. So yeah, both of those things need some context. So one thing I think that's really interesting. My mother is still alive. My father has passed away, but I never knew what political party my parents were growing up. It wasn't something that the adults in my life talked about when I was growing up. I knew they voted, but they never really talked about politics. You know, Ronald Reagan was president in my most formative years in the 1980s when I was growing up, when I was in elementary school, middle school, and high school. And so I always saw Ronald Reagan as a calming figure, and it was a young person, and that was not having my father in the house full time. And when, you know, I was deeply upset. I was 11 years old when the assassination attempt happened on Ronald Reagan, and that like moved me deeply. And you know, I always called him Uncle Ron. Uncle Ron told me it was going to be okay when the space shuttle blew up, and I believed him, you know. And so some of that was that teenage angst, looking for some kind of an anchor, was very interesting, and also feeling very patriotic, you know, always having that. As an adult, I do not feel the same way about former President Ronald Reagan. I still have fond affection and memories for those personal connections, but you know, the economy, the economic policies of Reagan were things that we're still experiencing today. Not necessarily progressive on social issues, right? Whether it was reproductive rights, completely ignored the AIDS crisis and just refused to acknowledge that. So while there were international crises, let's not forget Iran-Contra, right? There was a lot going on there. So I definitely see that through a different lens. The younger person in me who was looking for a stabilizing figure, I felt like I found that in a president who felt like he could be trusted. Ron and Nancy, right, were like an aunt and uncle to me. With respect to and I could not wait to vote in my first election. I proudly cast my vote for Michael Dukakis, and my illusions were dashed on election night when he lost in a massive landslide, right? And I had every intention of voting for Bill Clinton. This is how nerdy I am. I remember watching the Democratic National Convention when I was 18. I was in my aunt and uncle's house, and watching Bill Clinton speak. at the DNC. You may remember at the time it was like the longest speech ever, and people applauded when he was said. And in conclusion, not because it was a great speech, they were ready for it to be done. So I'd known about Bill Clinton for a very long time, and having an Arkansas connection with my extended family was everybody had a Bill Clinton story, right? And so absolutely planned on voting for Clinton in '92. You may remember that H. Ross Perot ran that year as an alternative candidate, and a lot of people my age were like, down with the establishment. I'm not voting for either of them. I'm voting for Perot. That was a lot of young people back then, which I thought was a little silly. I'm like, I'm voting for Bill Clinton. There was never a question. Well, in the mitigating factor here was at the time I was part of the LDS church, the Mormon church, and I was in my missionary training, and this is how important it was for me to vote. I had my mom in Illinois mail my absentee ballot to Provo, Utah, so that I could vote and mail it back to my mom, and so that my vote would count. And it was just pure peer pressure. I had a young man who was in my class, and he was like, listen, I'm challenging you. My gut tells me you should not vote for Bill Clinton. I'm asking you to pray and ask about it. And I'm like, all right, I will. And that's kind of how that happened. So it was a long, long time ago. But I do write in the book, John, as you might recall, when I served my missionary, my mission, it was in Croatia and Serbia during the middle of the war, which was crazy. And in Serbia, America was not very well liked. And even though the United States was not directly involved, the United Nations was involved. There was a UN embargo. I would walk down the streets of Novi Sad, Serbia, and hear random people talk about how much they hated Bill Clinton and called him Little Hitler. And so the one saving grace, the one blessing, if you will, is I could say with full honesty, integrity, and fidelity, I did not vote for that man. So that's kind of an interesting little aside.
So there's a lot to unpack there, Wendy, and I want to push this back to Lewis because it ties in a couple of things that you said. You talked about Reagan, which was kind of at least your admiration at that point was about character. It was about the image, and then you talked about Bill Clinton, and the one and I was going to lead this into the current into Trump, not pro or con, but you mentioned something in your TED Talk, Lewis, about how people are set and they will gloss over character flaws in some of their images. And I had to go back because you brought up Clinton, which was 30 years ago, that people, many, at least the majority of the population, overlooked his character flaws. And even through the election. And that's sort of where we are right now, because there's obviously a pretty loyal base for Trump, and they tend to, some admire those as authenticity, others are overlooking the character flaws. What's your take? Where does that change? Has that evolved?
Absolutely, I agree. I mean, if you look at somebody like Donald Trump, even his conviction hasn't really changed votes, right? People absorb new information through a filter, and it takes a long time to convince them of something, even if it's a fact that they don't want to hear. And we see it at display in American politics at the impressive level, right? Now, people also may forgive policy disagreements. You may vote for somebody even if you disagree with them.
Look at the Cheneys. They're overlooking policy.
Totally, because they have a more important concern, right? And one thing I write in the book is, of course, the most fundamental framing in US politics and in many other places around the world is change versus more of the same, right? Basically, the election often comes down to this. I mean, that's the book, Beat the Incumbent. It's about re-electing the incumbent or voting for something new. And in this case, we don't have an incumbent president anymore. He dropped out. We almost forgot about it. It's actually not a long time ago. But we still have an incumbent party candidate, which is the vice president and obviously part of the Biden-Harris administration. And I think if I were Trump, I think he would need to make that case much more forcefully. He actually almost let her get away with defining herself as the change candidate, which was quite a political accomplishment. So I think still this is a change election. I think people are very unhappy with how things are going. And usually when I do focus groups and I think, by the way, the strategies are similar for local races, but if people are happy with how things are going, if they say positive words to describe their country or their state or their city, the incumbent wins in the vote. If they say negative words at the very beginning to describe their place, the challenger has an opening.
It's interesting, and you sort of answered the question. I think you answered the question, but challenge me. Who was the challenger and who was the incumbent in this race? And it almost seems that the Democrats are trying to make Trump the incumbent because he was in that office, and the Republicans are trying to make the Democrats incumbent because, as you said, it's an incumbent party.
Yes, and absolutely, that's exactly what Democrats should do. I think she should not do interviews. It's a trap. I have another YouTube video on this on my channel. People will always ask for specifics. Doesn't mean they like your specifics. The very first book about election campaigns, written by Cicero, who campaigned for consul in the late Roman Republic, said it. Don't be specific. It's a trap. She should talk about Donald Trump and J.D. Vance and remind people that they actually voted him out of office. And there was a reason why they did it. Why make yourself the issue? Turn up the heat on Trump and J.D. Vance. Now, people often think it was better before. I've seen this in other countries where I've worked for sons of presidents or successors. People often think it was better before because why? Not because their leaders were better, because they were younger, better looking, they were in better health, and they remember the good things. That's human nature. But Democrats' job is to remind people why they voted him out of office 4 years ago.
Well, I would say, Lewis, that I have felt, looking at the election, that Harris has tried or struggled to impugn and challenge Trump and, make him the election issue and, describe his character flaws, but she hasn't succeeded, it seems to me. And, man in the street interviews come back with the idea that she hasn't defined herself, who she is as a candidate, and she hasn't articulated forcefully, or at least on, her issues her policy issues are not getting out there, even though on her campaign website, she lays out, a pretty lengthy platform, but she hasn't defined herself and not transparent. And she hasn't landed any punches really successfully on Trump.
Just very briefly, about the not being defined, that's exactly what I meant before. It's an excuse. If you need more specifics from her, if you don't know where she stands, I mean, come on, look at the alternative. You're a hidden Trump voter. But I agree on turning up the heat on Trump and especially J.D. Vance.
I think that, John, you've asked us a couple of different times about polarization and why we are where we are. And I just don't know that we're a culture right now that thinks very deeply, reads very deeply, wants to actually dive into the issues very deeply. We're complacent with letting others tell us what it is, right? And so they're very sound bitey issues. I want to share a story with you that I haven't shared with a lot of people, but the day after the debate, the Biden-Trump debate, my thumbs hurt from texting so much that night. I'm like, oh my goodness. I attended a Kamala Harris private event the next day that was planned. And I thought, I don't know how this is going to go. And there were a couple hundred people in the room. And she walked in and she said, "We had a really bad night. It was really bad. I'm not going to defend it. I'm not even going to try. But let me tell you what we've got to do and why this election can't go to Donald Trump," and made a very compelling case. Like, I mean, she's a prosecutor, laid it out, and she had a group of friendlies, but I don't think the average American has the capacity or the will to care about that. Look at a couple of policy issues which no one is talking about: expanding Medicare to do in-home health care for our elderly citizens. Nobody's talking about that. Do you know how many families that would benefit? Some of the policy ideas for small businesses. Our country is built on the backbone of small businesses, right? Like, things that are very substantive, they're out there. They are not surfacing in a way that is making these things issues in our election. And is that the media's fault? Is that our fault? Like, I don't know. It's not that it's for lack of policy or lack of trying, but we want to keep fighting this playground fight about, character and morals. And people have already decided about that. I talked earlier about values. People have decided that they don't care who Donald Trump is if they're going to vote for him. Like, there's this massive cognitive dissonance or acceptance that that's okay, because the other things that he does matter more to them than these perceived character flaws from other people, right? And she has the same kind of problem or situation, that people have made decisions about her character or who she is or prosecutorial history, and therefore her substantive policies don't matter. So we're fighting this interesting cultural phenomenon that I don't know if it's our new normal, but that's kind of where we're at.
Yeah, unfortunate for our listeners and for John and myself, we're going to have to let our guest go shortly. We're sort of at the end of our time, but we want to do a couple things and wrap it up. But there's one question that's been kind of riding over, and Lewis, you talked about money, the role of money, and Wendy, you did too. And then we talked, and Wendy, you had mentioned about Gen Z. I heard an interview with David Hogue. I don't know if or David Hogg. I don't know if you're familiar with him, Lewis. He was one of the Parkland students, Parkland high school students that was shot or was involved in the shooting about 7 years ago. He became a political activist. He since graduated Harvard and so forth. And his goal was to, as soon as he could, it was being able to run for Congress. He turns 25 next month, and he was asked if he would is he going to run, and he said no, because of the money, because he was instrumental. He was the political activist. He created a PAC for Maxwell Frost, who's the youngest congressman. He's the young congressman from Florida and Orlando. So he worked with him. David actually raised like $8 million in this PAC. But he said he saw the toll it took to run a campaign. What would to both of you, because you both brought this up in different ways, what would your advice to be for a young person, because we want them to be involved? We always complain that they're sitting on the couch playing video games. We want them to be involved in our government, making these decisions, getting their viewpoints out, but kind of not being intimidated by the money. Either one of you could start.
I'll start. I mean, there are lots of ways to be involved, and there is a young person in my county, 19 years old, running for his local school board, and I am his biggest champion. And good for him. And he said, I know more about what the student experience is than any of these folks. And he can get into this for a couple of $1,000s, right? And that is an entry point that anybody can raise a couple of $1,000s. So, the federal races are obscene with the amount of money that needs to be raised and spent. That's not the only place to make influence. And so I would recommend to young people, one, if you want to run for Congress, you should run for Congress. If you want to run for president, meet the requirements and run for president, which mainly I'm talking about age, right? But there are other races where you can be very effective at the local level, and build a little bit of the muscle there, but do not let money be the intimidating factor. I mean, look at the amount of money that came into the Kamala Harris race recently. When people believe in you, they will donate to your campaign.
Lewis?
Yes, I'd like to nuance on the money thing. I think it's one of the important factors. Obviously, in particular in the US, it is an important factor. I've commented on a piece just the other day that this election cycle, 16 billion US dollars will be spent. So yes, I mean, and I write about it in my book, that sometimes people call me or approach me who want to run, and I'm just shocked how naive they are. I mean, they have great ideas. It's great to have great ideas, but the reality of running for office is brutal, money-wise, in terms of the scrutiny by the press, in terms of the name calling on social media. It has just become so common to bash and trash politicians and widely accepted. So I also would like to say, though, that money can be found. I think that for a good idea or an interesting narrative, you can raise a lot of money. So I would agree, like if you have a compelling story to make, you have a contribution to make, don't be naive about it, be brutally honest about it, but don't let it hold you back.
Two very quick questions and quick answers if we could get them in. Wendy, do you plan to run for higher office again? Utah House of Representatives, perhaps something larger on the national scale? And Lewis, what campaigns are you working on without identifying the candidates?
I always leave the door open, John. It's not in my plan, but it could be. And it will depend on if I feel like I can make influence. I mean, imagine, if you will, someone said, you should run for the Utah State Legislature. No one's ever going to respect you. They're not going to advance your bills. They're going to treat you different because you're a Democrat and you're a woman, but you should totally do that, right? So, but I'm in a great place of influence right now. I'm helping women get elected to office. That's really important to me. I have, platforms like this where I can speak to you freely. I'm not beholden to a party, to leadership, but stay tuned. There might be something in my future.
Okay. Lewis?
Well, Professor, if you do run, pick up a copy of my book, Beat the Incumbent.
It's on my list.
If you're running against an incumbent. And it just so happened that I do a lot of work in various Asian countries, from local races, Congress, up to the national level. So this is where I'm professionally. And I think, and it's another point I write about in the book, there is something to learn about election campaigns everywhere in the world. Americans are very focused on the US. There's a good reason for it, because US presidential elections are what the World Series or the World Cup are to sports. But that said, I think there is something to learn about election campaigns everywhere in the world where there are elections.
Lewis, what's the best way, I mean, other than purchasing your book, where's the best place for people to contact you, learn more about you, reach out to you, follow you?
On my website, louisperron.com, on my YouTube channel, Louis Perron, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, you name it, and plenty of free resources there about running for office.
And what about yourself, Wendy?
Yes, wendydavisutah.com, because there is another Wendy Davis. It gets a little confusing. Yeah. And also LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. I didn't get to talk to John about this, but I would love to extend an invitation to the both of you. This has been fascinating, to do a post-election show.
We should do that.
To get the analysis, to see what's there. So once things are over, whenever it is decided, hopefully it will be decided. Love to get your feedback, what we learned, what the next steps are, and again, just follow your careers as well. So hopefully you'll agree to that. Lewis, I know you're very short on time, so you need to cut out of here soon. But I want to thank all our listeners for, again, joining Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization in our special series at the corner of Main Street and Wall Street. Until next time, don't let the shift hit your plans.
Thanks for watching Geeks, Geezers, and Googlization. Be sure to listen to the podcast and follow us on YouTube.